My grandfather drowned himself in Loch Ness on my 18th birthday. They never found his body, which surprised no one who truly knew him. The lake had been claiming pieces of him for 60 years, his time, his sanity, his soul. In the end, it simply took what little remained. I am writing this in the same stone cottage where he raised me, where he taught me to gut fish and read the weather and keep secrets that would drive most men mad. The cottage sits on the northeastern shore, hidden in a fold of land that doesn't appear on most maps, accessible only by a rutted track that washes out every spring and freezes solid every winter. We liked it that way. Isolation was the first rule of guardianship. My name is Callum McAleish. I am 43 years old. I have been feeding the creature in Loch Ness for 25 years, continuing the work my grandfather began in 1923, and his father before him, and his father's father, stretching back into the mists of Scottish history when the loch had different names and the creature was worshipped rather than hunted. The feeding happens at dawn. Always at dawn. That is the second rule. This morning, as I loaded the ancient wooden boat with the day's offering, 30 pounds of fresh herring purchased from the fishmonger in Drumnadroshit, paid for in cash, no questions asked or answered, I felt the pull more strongly than ever before. Not a physical pull, though it starts that way, as a tightness in my chest and a heaviness in my limbs. But a mental pull. A calling. The same calling that took my grandfather on that cold March morning in 1983 when he rode out into the pre-dawn darkness and never came back. The lake wants me. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood, in the hollow spaces behind my eyes where sleep used to live. I have perhaps a year left. Maybe less. The creature is changing, growing restless, and the bond between keeper and kept is fraying like old rope under strain. But before the lake claims me, before I follow my grandfather into the cold embrace of water that remembers everything and forgives nothing, I need to tell someone what we've been doing all these years. What we've been protecting. What we've been sacrificing ourselves to keep hidden from a world that would destroy it out of fear or greed or simple, stupid curiosity. If you're listening to this confession, if my words have found you in whatever future exists beyond my own ending, then pay attention. Subscribe to this channel because what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about legends and monsters and the price of keeping the old promises. Hit that like button if you're ready for the truth, the real truth, not the tourist trap nonsense they sell in the gift shops. Share this with someone who understands that some stories are written in blood and water and 60 years of silent devotion. This is the story of the keepers of Loch Ness. This is my confession. This is my warning. I was 7 years old when my grandfather first took me to feed the creature. 7 years old, and already an orphan. My parents had died in a car accident on the A82, their vehicle sliding off the icy road and plunging into the loch during a winter storm. The police recovered the car. They never recovered the bodies. My grandfather collected me from the hospital in Fort William where I'd been staying with distant relatives who didn't know what to do with a traumatized child who barely spoke. "You'll live with me now," he said. Not a question. Not an invitation. A statement of fact as immutable as the stones that lined the loch's shore. His name was Angus McAleish, though everyone in the villages around the loch called him Old Angus, or sometimes just the Hermit. He was 73 years old, tall and gaunt as a winter tree, with eyes the color of the loch on a cloudy day, grey-green and impossible to read. He smelled of fish and pipe tobacco and something else, something cold and ancient that I wouldn't recognize until years later as the scent of deep water. The cottage was small and dark, heated by a single peat fire that never quite drove the dampness from the stone walls. There were 2 rooms, a main room with a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in one corner, and a smaller room barely large enough for a cot where I would sleep. No electricity. No telephone. No radio or television. Just the wind, the rain, the endless whisper of the loch lapping against the shore 30 meters from our door. "Tomorrow morning, you come with me," he said that first night, ladling thin soup into wooden bowls. "Early. Before the sun. You don't speak. You don't ask questions. You watch, and you learn, and you never, never tell anyone what you see. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I understood nothing. We rose at 4 in the morning, in darkness so complete it felt solid, oppressive. My grandfather moved through the cottage with the certainty of long practice, gathering things by touch, a canvas bag, a gaff hook, something wrapped in oilcloth that clinked softly. He handed me a wool coat that was too large and smelled of mothballs. "Put this on. It'll be cold on the water." The boat was pulled up on a small shingle beach, barely visible in the starlight. It was old, ancient, really, carved from a single massive oak log, the kind of craft that hadn't been made in Scotland for generations. My grandfather pushed it into the water with a strength that belied his age, then lifted me and set me in the bow like a sack of grain. He rowed in silence. The oars made barely a sound as they cut the water, and I watched the shore recede into blackness behind us. The loch was glass smooth, reflecting the stars, and I had the disorienting sensation of floating through space, suspended between heaven and earth with nothing to anchor me to reality. We rowed for perhaps 20 minutes, though time felt strange out there in the dark. Eventually, my grandfather shipped the oars and reached for the canvas bag. He pulled out a fish, a large salmon, already gutted, and held it up in both hands. "Watch," he whispered. He dropped the fish into the water. It sank immediately, disappearing into the black depths. We sat in silence, the boat rocking gently, my grandfather's eyes fixed on the water with an intensity that frightened me. Then the water moved. Not waves. Not ripples. Movement from below. Displacement. Something large rising from the depths, creating a swell that lifted our boat and set it down again gently, almost tenderly. I saw the shape in the water. Massive. Dark. Moving with impossible grace beneath the surface, circling our boat once, twice, 3 times. And then I saw the head. It broke the surface 10 meters from our bow, a serpentine neck, easily 2 meters long, supporting a head that was both reptilian and something else, something that didn't fit any category I knew. The eyes were large and intelligent, reflecting the starlight with an inner luminescence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the skull. The creature looked at my grandfather. My grandfather looked back. They held their gaze for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the creature's mouth opened, not threatening, but expectant, and my grandfather took another fish from the bag and threw it. The creature caught it with delicate precision, the jaws closing around it without so much as a splash. This happened 6 more times. 6 more fish. Each one accepted with the same careful grace, the same patient expectation. Then the creature sank. No dramatic dive. No thrashing tail. It simply descended, smoothly and silently, until the water was still again and we were alone in the darkness. My grandfather took up the oars and began rowing back to shore. He didn't speak. I didn't ask. But I understood, in the wordless way children sometimes understand impossible things, that my life had just changed forever. That I was now part of something ancient and terrible and beautiful. that I would never be free of the loch, or the creature, or the duty that had been passed down through generations of MacLeishes like a genetic curse. The feeding became routine. Every morning at dawn, regardless of weather or season, we would row out to the same location, a spot my grandfather navigated by landmarks I couldn't see, by instinct honed over 6 decades of repetition. The creature would rise. We would feed it. It would descend. We would return to shore. My grandfather spoke little during those first years, but slowly, grudgingly, he began to teach me. Not through explanations or lectures, but through demonstration and expectation. He showed me how to gut the fish properly, how to prepare them so they were fresh and clean and acceptable. He taught me to read the weather, to recognize when storms were coming and when the loch would be too dangerous for our small boat. He taught me to be invisible, to move through the villages and towns around the loch without drawing attention, to purchase supplies without forming relationships, to exist in society while remaining fundamentally separate from it. "We are not part of their world," he said once, the most words I'd heard from him in days. "We serve something older. Something that was here before them and will be hereafter. Our duty is to the creature, not to people. Never forget that." I was 11 when he first told me the history. We were sitting by the peat fire on a winter night, the wind howling around the cottage, rain hammering the thick walls. He had been drinking, rare for him, and the whiskey had loosened his tongue. My grandfather told me this story. He began, staring into the flames. His grandfather told him. It goes back further than anyone remembers. Before the clans. Before the Romans. Before the Picts, even. He took another drink. The creature is not an animal. Not in the way they think. It's not some leftover dinosaur or unknown species of seal. It's older than that. Older than mammals. Older than, well, older. What is it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. A survivor. A remnant. The last of something that should have died out with the ice ages but didn't. It adapted. It learned. It made arrangements. Arrangements. With us. With humans. A long time ago, when the loch was different, when it connected to the see-through channels that have long since silted up or collapsed, the creature was trapped here. It could have died. Should have died. But it didn't. It found the people who lived along the shore, our ancestors, and it made them an offer. He fell silent for so long I thought he wouldn't continue. Then, protection for provision. Safety for sacrifice. The creature would guard the loch, keep it pure, keep it deep, keep it mysterious. And in return, we would feed it. We would keep it secret. We would make sure it never went hungry, never had to hunt, never had to expose itself in ways that would bring the hunters and the scientists and the fools with their nets and their harpoons. But why us? I asked. Why our family? Because we accepted. Because we understood. Because we've kept the promise for so long that it's written into our blood now. The creature knows us. Trusts us. We're bound to it in ways I can't explain and you wouldn't understand even if I could. Before I continue this history, I need you to understand something. My grandfather wasn't mad. He wasn't delusional. Every word he spoke that night was the truth, witnessed by generations of keepers who gave their lives to this duty. If you're still listening, if you haven't dismissed this as the ramblings of a lunatic, then subscribe now. Hit that like button if you believe there are old promises still being kept in the forgotten corners of the world. Because what comes next is where the cost becomes clear. He drained his glass and set it down with a heavy thunk. The creature is dying, Callum. Slowly. Very slowly. But dying nonetheless. The loch is changing. The water is warmer. There's pollution from the villages, from the boats, from the tourists who come to gawk and take pictures. The food we bring sustains it, but it's not enough. Not anymore. What will happen when it dies? My grandfather looked at me with eyes that held a century of sorrow. Then we die too. Because we're bound to it. When it goes, it takes us with it. That's the final part of the arrangement. That's the sacrifice our ancestors made. We don't just feed the creature. We belong to it. And when it's ready, when it's time, the loch will call us home. I was 16 when I tried to run away. It was summer, July of 1981, and the loch was busy with tourists and their boats and their cameras. Every morning when we rode out to feed the creature, I could see them in the distance, the early risers hoping for a glimpse of the monster, their binoculars trained on the water, their expensive equipment ready to capture proof. They saw nothing, of course. The creature had learned caution over the centuries, had learned to time its surfacing to those precious minutes when the loch was empty, when only we were there to witness. But their presence made me angry. Made me realize how much I'd given up, how much had been taken from me without my consent. I had no friends. No education beyond what my grandfather taught me. No future except an endless repetition of dawn feedings and isolation and the slow slide into whatever madness or death had claimed the keepers before me. I was 16 years old, and I had never kissed a girl, never been to a cinema, never done any of the normal things that normal teenagers did. So I packed a bag. Not much, some clothes, what little money I'd managed to save from odd jobs in Drumnadroshit, a photograph of my parents that my grandfather had given me. I planned to hitchhike to Inverness, then Edinburgh, then anywhere that wasn't here. I would start a new life. I would be normal. I left at midnight, when my grandfather was asleep. I made it almost 3 miles down the track before the pain started. It began as a tightness in my chest, like I couldn't quite catch my breath. Then my legs started to cramp, the muscles seizing so hard I fell to my knees on the muddy path. My head filled with pressure, with a sound like rushing water, and beneath that sound was something else, a voice, though not in any language I could understand. The creature was calling me back. I tried to keep walking. Made it another 20 meters before I vomited, then collapsed completely, my body refusing to obey my will. I lay there in the mud, shaking and crying and feeling the pull of the loch like a physical rope around my chest, dragging me back toward the water. My grandfather found me at dawn. He didn't say anything. Just picked me up. I was small for my age, and he was still strong, and carried me back to the cottage. He laid me on my cot and sat beside me while the pain slowly faded, while my breathing returned to normal, while the pressure in my head receded like an ebbing tide. "You can't leave," he said finally. "I'm sorry, boy. I wish you could. But you've fed the creature. You've been bound. The only way out now is death, and even then." He trailed off, staring at the wall. Even then what? Even then, I'm not sure. My grandfather tried to drown himself once, before I was born. Changed his mind at the last minute, or so he told me. Said he felt the creature beneath him, holding him up, pushing him back to the surface. Like it wouldn't let him die. Not until it was ready. I closed my eyes. felt the tears leaking from beneath my eyelids. "I hate you," I whispered. "I know," my grandfather said. I hated my father too. But hate doesn't change the duty. Hate doesn't break the bond. You'll learn to accept it eventually. Or you won't. Either way, you'll stay. He was right, of course. I stayed. What choice did I have? I stopped fighting after that. What was the point? I was bound to the creature as surely as a prisoner is bound to his cell, and rebellion only brought pain. So I accepted. I learned. I became what my grandfather needed me to become, a proper keeper, ready to take over when his time came. He taught me the deeper secrets during those years. Showed me the journal that had been passed down through the generations, filled with observations and notes in different hands, different inks, spanning centuries. I learned that the creature was not alone, that there had been others once, long ago, before the loch became isolated from the sea. I learned that it could communicate, after a fashion, through emotions and impressions rather than words. I learned that it was intelligent in ways we barely understood, that it remembered things from before human civilization, that it dreamed dreams that sometimes leaked into the minds of the keepers and drove them slowly mad. I learned that my grandfather was dying. I learned that my grandfather was dying. Not from any disease or injury, but from the bond itself. He was 82 years old and had been feeding the creature for 60 years. The connection had grown so strong that he barely slept anymore, that he could feel the creature's presence even when we were miles from the loch, that sometimes he would wake screaming from dreams that weren't his own. "It's almost time," he told me on a grey morning in early March, 1983. We were rowing back from the feeding, the creature's wake still visible on the water behind us. "I can feel it. The lake is calling." "Don't go," I said, though I knew it was useless. "I have no choice. None of us do. It's the final duty, to give ourselves to the water when the creature is ready, to become part of the loch, part of its domain. My grandfather did it. His father did it. Now it's my turn." "When?" "Soon. A few days. Maybe a week. I'll know when it's time." He lasted another 2 weeks. On the morning of my 18th birthday, I woke to find his bed empty, the cottage door standing open. I ran to the shore and saw the boat, far out on the loch, drifting empty. I found his clothes folded neatly on the beach. His pipe. His watch. A note written in his careful, spidery hand. Asterisk, continue the feeding. Protect the secret. The creature is yours now. I'm sorry. Asterisk. They searched for 3 days. Used sonar, brought in divers, dragged the area where the boat had been found. Nothing. The loch kept him, as it had kept all the keepers before him, as it would someday keep me. I was 18 years old, completely alone, and bound for life to a creature that would eventually devour everything I was. That was 25 years ago. The first 5 years alone were the hardest. I was young, inexperienced, and completely unprepared for the weight of the duty. The feeding continued, it had to continue, the bond wouldn't allow anything else, but everything else fell apart around me. The cottage deteriorated. I had no money for repairs, and even if I had, I wouldn't have known how to fix the leaking roof or the crumbling chimney or the door that no longer closed properly. I survived on fish I caught myself and vegetables from the small garden my grandfather had maintained. I wore his old clothes until they fell apart, then bought second-hand replacements from charity shops in Fort William, always paying cash, always avoiding conversation. I became what my grandfather had been, a ghost, a hermit, a strange figure the locals whispered about but never approached. Old Angus's grandson, they called me, though I wasn't old, wasn't even 30 yet. The one who lives by the water. Bit touched, that one. Best leave him be. The isolation would have been bearable if not for the dreams. They started about 6 months after my grandfather died. At first, they were just impressions, sensations of cold water, of pressure, of darkness so complete it had texture and weight. But they grew stronger, more detailed, more invasive. I dreamed I was swimming in the loch, but my body was wrong, too long, too powerful, moving through the water with a grace no human could achieve. I dreamed I was hunting, though the loch had few fish large enough to satisfy the hunger that gnawed at my belly. I dreamed I was ancient, so ancient that the mountains themselves were young by comparison, and I remembered when the ice had covered everything and the water had been different, colder, purer. These weren't my dreams. They were the creature's dreams, bleeding into my mind through the bond that connected us. And with each passing year, they grew stronger, more frequent, until I could barely distinguish between my own thoughts and the thoughts of something that had existed for millennia. I started talking to myself. Long conversations with nobody, or with my grandfather's ghost, or with the creature itself. I would stand on the shore at night and speak to the water, telling it things I'd never told anyone, my fears, my loneliness, my growing certainty that I wouldn't survive as long as my grandfather had, that the bond would consume me long before I reached old age. The creature listened. I knew it did. Sometimes I would feel a response, not words, never words, but a sense of acknowledgement, of understanding, of something almost like compassion from a being that existed so far outside human emotion that compassion was probably the wrong word entirely. By my 30th birthday, I looked 50. My hair had gone grey at the temples. My hand shook. I had lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. The doctor in Drumnadroshit, during a rare visit when a bad tooth had driven me to seek help, told me I was severely anemic, probably malnourished, and asked if I was eating properly. I lied and said yes. The truth was that I'd stopped caring about food, about sleep, about anything except the feeding. The morning ritual was all that mattered. Everything else was just marking time until the lake called me home. Everything changed in the summer of 1995. Her name was Sarah Pritchard, and she was 26 years old, a marine biology student from the University of Edinburgh doing research on Loch Ness ecology for her master's thesis. She had rented a cottage in Invermariston for the season and spent her days taking water samples, cataloguing fish populations, documenting the tourist impact on the local ecosystem. She was also, unfortunately, an early riser. I first saw her on a Wednesday morning in late June. I was rowing out to the feeding site, the canvas bag of fish heavy in the bottom of the boat, when I noticed another vessel on the water, a small inflatable with an outboard motor, anchored about half a kilometer from my usual location. A figure sat in the boat, hunched over what looked like sampling equipment. I should have turned back. Should have waited until the next morning, hoping she wouldn't be there. But the creature was waiting. I could feel it in the water beneath me, could sense its hunger, its expectation. The feeding couldn't be delayed. I rowed on, hoping the distance and the early morning gloom would hide what I was doing. I was wrong. I went through the ritual mechanically, trying to be quick, trying to be discreet. Dropped the first fish. Waited. Felt the water move as the creature rose from the depths. saw the neck break the surface, the head turning toward our boat, and heard a sharp cry from the inflatable half a kilometer away. She'd seen it. Through binoculars, probably, or a telephoto lens. She'd seen the creature take the fish from the water. I need to stop here and tell you something important. What happened next, what I did next, changed everything. If you're still with me, if you want to understand the full cost of being a keeper, then you need to subscribe right now. Hit that like button if you're ready for the darkest part of this confession. Because this is where I stopped being just a guardian and became something else entirely. The creature submerged immediately, sensing the danger. I finished the feeding as quickly as I could, throwing the remaining fish into the water and letting the creature take them from below, then rowed back to shore as fast as my arms would carry me. I spent the rest of that day in a panic, waiting for the authorities to arrive, for police and scientists and journalists to descend on the loch with their questions and their cameras and their nets. Waiting for everything my family had protected for generations to be destroyed because one curious student had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But no one came. The next morning, driven by a desperation I barely understood, I hiked to Invermariston. It took me 3 hours through rough terrain, but I found her cottage easily enough, a small holiday rental on the outskirts of the village, with a battered Land Rover parked outside and research equipment scattered across the porch. I watched the cottage for hours from the cover of the woods. Watched her come and go, carrying equipment, making notes, acting like someone who hadn't just witnessed the impossible. She was small, dark-haired, wearing practical clothes and moving with the efficient purpose of someone comfortable working alone. She drove to the village store just before noon. I waited until she was inside, then approached her Land Rover. Her research notes were on the passenger seat, visible through the window. I could see my handwriting on the top page. June 23, 5:47, observed large aquatic animal, approximate 6 to 8 meters visible length, feeding behavior, interaction with human in traditional boat. Neck structure consistent with plesiosaur morphology but coloration and skin texture anomalous. Requires further observation. My hands were shaking as I read. She was a scientist. She would come back. She would document. She would tell others. She would destroy everything. I waited by her Land Rover until she emerged from the store, her arms full of groceries. "Miss Pritchard," I said. She nearly dropped her bags. Spun to face me, her expression cycling rapidly from surprise to alarm to a forced calmness that didn't quite hide her fear. I realized what I must look like, a gaunt, grey-haired stranger who'd appeared from nowhere, who knew her name, who was standing between her and her vehicle. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "My name is Callum McAlish. I live on the northeastern shore. I'm the one you saw this morning. In the boat." Her face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You saw it. You wrote notes about it. I need you to understand something, Miss Pritchard. I need you to understand very clearly, and then I need you to leave this place and never come back." She didn't leave. Instead, she invited me into her cottage, brave or foolish, I couldn't tell which, and made tea while I sat at her small kitchen table and tried to explain the inexplicable. I told her everything. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. She'd seen the creature. She documented it. The only way to protect the secret now was to make her understand why it had to remain secret, why centuries of keepers had given their lives to keep the world from knowing what lived in the loch. She listened. Asked questions. took notes despite my protests. She was a scientist to her core, unable to hear an extraordinary story without documenting it, analyzing it, poking holes in it. "You're telling me you're telepathically bonded to a prehistoric creature," she said finally, her tone carefully neutral. "And your family has been feeding it for generations. And if you stop, or if the creature is discovered, both you and it will die." "Yes." "That's insane." "I know." "Prove it." I looked at her across the table, this young woman with her whole life ahead of her, her education and her career and her future. I thought about my grandfather, about all the keepers before him, about the price we'd paid to keep the promise. "Come with me tomorrow morning," I said. "Come and see for yourself. Then decide what you're going to do." She came. We met at the shore before dawn, and I helped her into my grandfather's boat. She brought a camera, a notebook, a sense of barely contained excitement that made my chest tight with dread. We rowed out in silence, the water smooth as glass, the world holding its breath. The creature came when I threw the first fish. Sarah gasped, a small, sharp sound of wonder and terror combined. The creature surfaced slowly, its neck rising from the water like a periscope, the head turning to regard us with those luminous eyes. It took the fish from my hand, not from the water, which I'd never allowed before, and I felt Sarah's shock like a physical thing beside me. "My God," she whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." The creature fed. 7 fish, taken with delicate precision. Then it did something it had never done before, something that made my blood run cold. It approached the boat, came right up to the side, its head level with Sarah's, and looked at her. Studied her. The eyes, ancient, intelligent, alien, held her gaze for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. Then it spoke. Not with words. Not with sound. But I felt it in my mind, clear and undeniable, and from Sarah's sharp intake of breath I knew she felt it too. Asterisk another keeper. Asterisk. The creature submerged. We sat in stunned silence as it vanished into the depths, leaving only ripples that spread across the smooth water and eventually faded to nothing. What did it mean? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. What did it mean, another keeper? I knew what it meant. I'd known from the moment the creature had looked at her, from the moment it had chosen to reveal itself so completely. But I didn't want to say it out loud. Didn't want to make it real. It's choosing you, I said finally. It's choosing you to help carry the burden. To share the duty. But I'm not. I don't want. Neither did I. Neither did my grandfather. It doesn't matter what we want. The creature decides. And it's decided that I'm not enough anymore, that I won't last much longer, that it needs someone else. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the implication settled over her like a shroud. I can leave. I can go back to Edinburgh. I can forget this ever happened. You can try, I said. But you won't make it far. Trust me. I tried when I was 16. The bond doesn't let you go once it's formed. Sarah stayed. What choice did she have? She felt the bond forming over the next few weeks, the pull toward the water, the dreams that weren't her own, the sense of the creature's presence always lurking at the edge of her consciousness. She fought it at first, tried to resist, but eventually she accepted what I'd accepted years before, that we were bound, that we belonged to the Loch now, that our lives were no longer entirely our own. She moved into my grandfather's cottage. There was nowhere else for her to go, and the isolation that had been slowly killing me became bearable with someone to share it. We fell into a routine, feeding the creature together at dawn, spending the days maintaining the cottage and the boat and our increasingly fragile grip on sanity, talking in the evenings about the lives we'd lost and the duty we'd inherited. We became partners. Then friends. Then something more than friends, something born of shared trauma and shared purpose and the desperate human need for connection in the face of impossible circumstances. She was 32 when we married, a quiet ceremony in Fort William, witnessed by strangers, followed by a wedding night in a hotel room that felt bizarrely normal after years of sleeping in a drafty cottage with the constant presence of the loch outside our door. We should leave, she said that night, lying in my arms in a real bed with clean sheets and central heating. We should run. Together. As far as we can go. We'd be dead before we reached Glasgow, I said. Maybe that would be better than this. Better than slowly drowning on dry land. Maybe, I agreed. But we won't. Because the creature needs us. And we need it, whether we want to admit it or not. We're bound, Sarah. For better or worse. Until death. Listen to me carefully, because this is important. What I'm about to tell you is the heart of this confession, the reason I needed to record this before the lake takes me. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to everything I've said, then subscribe now because you're part of this too. You're witnessing. You're remembering. And maybe, somehow, that matters. Hit that like button if you understand that some bonds can't be broken, even by death. Share this with someone who needs to know that love and duty and sacrifice don't always look the way we expect them to. She gave me 7 years. 7 years of shared feeding, shared dreams, shared burden. 7 years of something that looked almost like happiness, if you squinted and didn't look too closely at the shadows. Then the creature began to change. It had been declining for years, I'd known that, had seen it in the way it moved more slowly, took longer to surface, sometimes failed to appear for the feeding at all. But in 2002, the decline accelerated. The creature was dying, and as it died, it pulled harder on the bonds that connected us to it. Sarah felt it first. She was younger, more recently bound, more vulnerable. She started losing weight, losing color, moving through the cottage like a ghost. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, spent hours standing on the shore, staring at the water, listening to something I couldn't quite hear. "It's calling," she said one night, her voice distant and dreamy. "Can't you hear it? It's calling us home." "Not yet," I said, though I could feel it too, the pull growing stronger, the sense of the loch opening like a mouth, hungry and patient and inevitable. "Not yet, Sarah. Please." But she was already gone, really. Already lost to the water and the creature and the bond that had wrapped around her soul and squeezed until there was nothing left but duty and sacrifice and the terrible, beautiful call of the deep. She went to the loch on a Tuesday morning in October, while I was in Drumnadroshit buying supplies. I came home to find her shoes on the shore, her clothes folded neatly, a note that said only, "I'm sorry. I love you. Feed the creature." They searched for 3 days. Found nothing. The loch kept her, as it had kept my grandfather, as it would someday keep me. I was 40 years old, alone again, and the creature was still dying. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of feeding the creature alone, watching it weaken, feeling the bond tighten around my chest like a vice. 6 years of waiting for the call, knowing it could come any day, any hour, any moment. It's coming now. I can feel it. Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning at the latest. The creature is ready to die, and it won't die alone. That's not how this works. That's never been how this works. The keepers die with what they protect. We give ourselves to the water. We become part of the loch, part of the mystery, part of the legend. That's the final duty, the last sacrifice, the price that was set centuries ago by ancestors whose names I'll never know. I'm not afraid. I should be, but I'm not. I'm tired. So tired. The bond has consumed everything, my youth, my health, my wife, my life. All that's left is the duty, and soon even that will be done. I made this recording because someone needs to know. Not to warn them, there's nothing to warn about, really. The creature will die. The bond will die with it. No one else will be called to be a keeper. The duty will end with me. But someone needs to know that we existed. That we served. That we kept the promise for as long as we could. Someone needs to know that the legends are real, but the reality is so much sadder and stranger and more beautiful than anyone imagines. The creature isn't a monster. It's a survivor, the last of its kind, alone in a world that has moved on and left it behind. And we weren't heroes. We were just people, broken, bound, trying to honor a duty we inherited but never chose. I'm going to the shore now. I'm going to push the old boat into the water one last time and row out to where the loch is deepest and the starlight reflects on the surface like scattered diamonds. I'm going to wait for the creature to rise, and I'm going to touch it one final time, and then I'm going to slip into the water and let the cold take me home. Sarah is waiting there. My grandfather is waiting there. All the keepers who came before us are waiting there, in the deep places where the water is old and the darkness is complete and the bonds that held us to the world above finally, mercifully, let go. I'm at the end now. The end of my story, the end of the duty, the end of a promise that stretched back further than memory. If you've listened to all of this, if you've stayed with me through the darkness and the drowning and the terrible, beautiful truth of what it means to be bound to something ancient and dying, then I need you to do something for me. *** subscribe to this channel. Not for me, I'll be gone, but for all the keepers who came before. We deserve to be remembered. We deserve to have our story told. ***. Hit that like button if this story moved you. If it made you think about duty and sacrifice and the price of keeping old promises. If it made you look at Loch Ness differently, not as a joke or a tourist trap, but as a grave marker for people who gave everything to protect something the world would never understand. And share this. Share it with everyone. Share it with people who believe in legends and people who don't. Share it with scientists and dreamers and anyone who's ever stood on the shore of a deep lake and wondered what might be looking back at them from beneath the surface. Because the creature is real. The keepers were real. And somewhere in the cold, dark water of Loch Ness, we're all still there, keeping watch, keeping faith, keeping the promise until the end of everything. The loch is calling. It's time to go home. This recording was found in the cottage of Callum McAleish on November 3, 2008, 6 weeks after he was reported missing. His body was never recovered. Marine biology student Sarah McAleish, née Pritchard, disappeared in October 2002. Her body was also never recovered. Neither death has been satisfactorily explained. The feeding has stopped. The creature, if it ever existed, has not been seen since.